This particular episode was made primarily for international audiences. I promise you, when it comes to World War II, you won't find such a comprehensive podcast on the internet. This man's knowledge, this man's know-how, and just the amount of data he's able to retain in his own mind. We have spoken about the chronology of World War II, but we've also gone on a lot of deep tangents. We've brought in conspiracy theories. We've brought in a sort of dissection of the world wars, and we've spoken about the modern day geopolitical impact that the two world wars had on our planet. Remember to follow us on Spotify. We're a Spotify exclusive, which means that every episode is available on Spotify 48 hours before it's available anywhere else in the world. This is Abhijit Chavda with his commentary on world history. Mr. Chavda, welcome back to the Ranveer show.
Thank you very much. Always great to be with you.
We've been creating some super hit podcasts of late. They're centered around geopolitics, a subject that the world needs to know more about, primarily because traditional news media hasn't been reporting geopolitical news the way it should be. And I feel a big section of the world has turned to the world of podcasts, the world of Twitter to get the information. But I also feel to truly understand geopolitics, you have to understand the history of the world, which also allows you to kind of predict the future a little bit. But let's begin by talking about World War II specifically. For the modern day geopolitical scenario, do you feel that that event, those few years were kind of impactful for the rest of the century?
Very much so, because the events of the two world wars, they set up the geopolitical chessboard for the Cold War to ensue. So everything that we are seeing today in the world is a consequence of what happened in that 30-year period in which you had the two world wars, which I actually call the European tribal wars. That's what it was.
Including technology, like even
yes.
What domains kind of got affected other than just geopolitics?
Technology really shaped up in this period, because when World War I started, there were weapons available at that time itself that had never been used before. So it was all new technology they were using at the time. And it took them some time to get used to it and to figure out how to use it. Then you had the advent of chemical weapons, a horrible thing. Then airplanes in warfare. First it was used for reconnaissance, then they started equipping planes with machine guns, then bombs and all that. So all of this took off. Tanks were first introduced in World War I and so much more.
And a lot of these wartime technologies eventually translate themselves to become everyday technologies for mankind.
See, any technology typically is first used by the military. And then there are spin-offs of those technologies that have civilian applications. So typically the military in any country is using technology that's 20 years before it comes out into the civilian domain.
The reason I bring up technology so early in this podcast is because I think our entire generation takes technology for granted.
Yes.
It's so much around us, but we don't understand the impact that those years had, because our generations have never actually faced a severe world war yet. I say yet with a lot of caution. I think our last episode was about World War III and its possibilities. We'll talk about that probably in the next episode. We'll address this whole World War III angle again. Right now, let's get back to World War II, the 1930s, or as far back as you want to take it. Where would you start this whole World War II story, sir?
Yeah, the last time we spoke about Ukraine, I went back 2000 years. So let me not do that this time. I will go back to the 19th century. So World War I, so I call these two wars the European tribal wars. That's what, it's European conflict, old historical grievances and all that spilled out, and it kind of engulfed the world. But it was primarily caused in Europe, and the causes were European. So there were two wars. The first war was called the Great War. And then you had the second Great War, which they now call World War I and World War II. So World War I began in 1914. So to understand the causes, you have to go back in time. Let's go back at least 50, 60 years. So Europe has always been a place of great conflict. There's always been these conflicts between various kings, emperors and all that. So typically conflict goes back, the root cause of conflict is territory, it's power. So historically, Europe has been a feudal place. Feudal lords ruled various dominions in Europe, and the power, it came from land. They owned vast tracts of land, and the real power came from the agriculture that happened in this land. So they had complete control over agriculture. This is before the Industrial Revolution. So the great lords, the great kings, emperors, they would own massive amounts of land, and everybody who lived on that land was peasants, and they would pay taxes to these people in the form of typically agricultural produce or something else. So that is where, and they had armies to control these people. So, and previously they also had slavery. So historically, that was the source of power of the great lords and kings and emperors. Then the Industrial Revolution happened, and then what happened is the entire society changed. The power and the money, the source of wealth became industries. And most of the industries were concentrated in the urban centers. So then the peasants were incentivized to move to urban centers. New rich people came up, and the old power structure was kind of shaken up, and that caused a lot of conflicts.
Who did the industries sell to? All the rest of the world.
The industries were about creating new technologies, and they would typically sell it to armies, to the people.
Okay.
Right, to the people. I mean, people want things like light bulbs or whatever. I'm just giving a random example, but lots of new things came up. Transportation, steam engines, cotton, producing cotton in a industrial manner, in a mechanical manner, instead of doing it by hand. So that also, I mean, people need these things, right? In the past, peasants were very poor. They used to wear ragtag clothing. Now they also aspired to wear good clothing and all that. So you could produce that in a cheap way and sell it to peasants and make money out of that, and that sort of thing. So the society changed because of all these massive changes that came about due to the Industrial Revolution.
I have to stop you there just for a second, because I feel that the point of podcast is what your history books don't teach you anywhere in the world. Two questions, and we've brought this up in our previous podcast as well. Do you think that secret society / Illuminati / a small group of powerful individuals were actually responsible for these decisions? Because when you read about this in retrospect, where one guy getting killed sparked off an entire war, it can't be as simple as that. And there have to have been other motivations for people to go to war. And often when countries go to war, it does boost the economy, like we've seen in the case of Russia and Ukraine. So were there actual underlying economic angles to this? That do you think, according to you, as a geopolitical observer, as someone who's very well read about history, what were the underlying intentions that we don't read about in history books? So the first question is about Illuminati. The second question is about this whole Britain angle. Do you think even they wanted the war back then? Do you think that keeping all this whole imperialistic world in mind, the colonies of the world, what was Britain's kind of game plan back then?
So let's come to Britain first. Britain was playing a defensive game. They had a big empire to manage. They did not want to lose access to that empire. And they needed access to certain choke points like Suez, the Persian Gulf and things like that. They also were dependent on oil from Mesopotamia, from Kuwait, from present-day Iraq, that region. So they had a big network. They administered about 1/4 of the world's geography, and it was a defensive game for that. If things spiral out of control, they will lose access to certain territories, which will be a disaster for them, because empire is what matters. So Britain they did not want war.
Okay.
They were trying to, they were actually isolated. They did not care much, but then they were trying to kind of stop war if possible, right? So that was their stance. Now, Illuminati and all that, Europe was a tinderbox at the time. It was a tinderbox because of all these old rivalries and ethnic enmities and feuds. The Ottoman Empire had converted certain populations in Bosnia to a different religion, to the Islamic religion. You had Christians, you had Muslims in a certain region, and you also had old rivalries between these families, between these dynasties. So they all looked at each other with suspicion, with jealousy, with enmity. And all it needed was a spark to set the whole thing aflame.
Kind of where the world stands right now, with China possibly on the verge of invading
This
Taiwan.
is why we discuss these matters, because there are certain patterns which happen in a cyclic manner, like you say. And we may be seeing something very similar today also again. No?
You know, this is why when young students say, oh, why should I study history? What's the point of history? One, it teaches you the art of storytelling. Two, it teaches you how to predict the future of your own race.
Yes.
So it is very important. And that's why even I want to revise this World War II and World War I kind of history. Okay, I'll let you continue, sir. What happened?
Right. So the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. What happens is that the Austro-Hungarian Empire blames Serbia for that. Russia says we are allies with Serbia. Austro-Hungary asks Germany, is it okay if you go to war with Serbia? They say, go ahead. So they declare war on Serbia. In end of July 1914, they try to attack Serbia. They bombard Serbia, but it doesn't work. The Serbs resist stoutly, fiercely, and that goes nowhere. But now what happens is that Germany takes the opportunity. They declare war, kind of declare war on two sides, on Russia and on France. Now, the Germany-France region, there's a whole old history there. The Germans had annexed some part of France in the last war in the 19th century. So the French had some debts to pay there. But the German-France border was very well fortified. There were very strong French fortifications. So the Germans went through Luxembourg and Belgium. The moment they enter Belgium, the British said, we have assured Belgium's neutrality. You have broken that. So we need to get involved in this. So the British get involved. They send troops to France and all that. So that's what happens. Now the Germans, there's something called the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was that Germany would advance through Luxembourg, through Belgium from the north, and then invade France and take Paris. So that happens. They go through Belgium. There's a very strong Belgian resistance. Then the British also get involved. Then these guys come all the way into France. And there is the Battle of the Marne River. There's a river called the Marne. Terrible, terrible battle. And then they try to take Paris, doesn't work out. And then over time, what happens is that there is trench warfare that happens. So both sides dig in, they create trenches. And these trenches, they go from the North Sea all the way to Switzerland.
You got to give a little context on trenches.
So trench warfare. So what happens is that both sides, they dig trenches against each other. Maybe they are 50 meters apart, maybe 100 meters apart. You can hear the other side talking, but you are dug into your trenches, and then you can fight each other for months at a time. It's terrible. It's oppressive. There are rats. There are dead bodies. You can't remove them. It's horrific. Disease of all kinds, and typhus and cholera and whatnot. So this is what happened on the Western Front. The line was frozen for a very long time. On the Eastern Front, what happens is that the Ottoman Empire allies with Germany, with Austro-Hungary, and they declare war on Russia. So in the Caucasus region, they try to invade Russia. Doesn't work. It's a disaster. The troops freeze to death in the thousands, tens of thousands, Ottoman troops. That doesn't work. They try to bomb Odessa, Sevastopol, these places which are currently at war right now. So the Ottoman Empire tries to do that, doesn't work. Then the British land an Indian expeditionary force in Kuwait to try and take Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. That kind of ends in a disaster. Our people die in that.
Fighting the Ottoman Empire. On the side of the British. Mr. Mohandas Gandhi was actively involved in recruiting millions of Indian soldiers for this. I think about 1.5 million Indian soldiers fought for the British in this war. Right? So what happens is that there is internationalization of the conflict. Yeah, that's actually what's not spoken about.
Yes.
Even in Indian textbooks, I remember studying World War I and World War II, once in the 5th grade, once in about, I think, the 8th or 9th grade. And nowhere was it mentioned that there was a lot of Indian troops. I won't say Indian, I'll call it brown troops, subcontinental troops involved in these battles. And how when they say British took part, it was heavily actually subcontinental troops.
There was a lot of subcontinental involvement in this British India. About 1.5 million Indian troops, British Raj troops, fought for the British, died for the British. Then there was a British attempt to reinforce the Russian position. To do that, they had to go through the Turkish Straits. This was a plan hatched by Winston Churchill. So there are two narrow choke points in Turkey, the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus. The Bosphorus Strait and the Dardanelles Strait. So the British tried to land an expeditionary force at the Dardanelles. That ended in complete disaster because of a Turkish general called Mustafa Kemal, who became eventually the dictator and the father of modern Turkey. So this guy stopped the British and he defeated them over many months of horrific fighting, terrible fighting. So the Ottoman Empire is involved. They try to invade Egypt and take Suez. That again is defended by the British because they need that for access to India, and the Ottoman Empire fails there. So there's a lot happening. Then Germany and France are still fighting. Italy gets involved because they are on the side of the Allies, not on the side of Germany. And they start fighting the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There is a certain river whose name I forget. They fought like 12, 15, 500, 800 battles there. Never moved. So that went on for a very long time. All kinds of sides are involved in this.
So like in the same way that the British used subcontinental troops, I'm dead sure they must have used all like troops from other colonies as well.
Yes.
And similarly, did the other European powers also bring all their colonies into play?
Indeed. That's why they now call it the First World War. Because the Germans, they had possessions in Africa. Togoland, Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, which is now called Namibia. There was an Eastern Territory as well. So all of this got involved. The French had many possessions, colonies in Africa. They recruited about 1 million soldiers, black African soldiers from there, and made them fight in the European War. So everything got involved. The Germans had possessions in the Pacific, islands that they possessed. The Japanese got involved. The Japanese were on the side of the British at this time in World War I. The Japanese took over various German islands and possessions and a German possession in China as well. Australia and New Zealand took over some other German territories in the Asia Pacific region. So everything got involved here. The whole world is kind of involved in this.
Other than South America?
Other than South America, yes. There was action near South America also. German warships, they fought the British Navy near the Falkland Islands. And there was a naval battle there also. So everywhere there is something or the other happening, some action happening. Then what happens is even Bulgaria got involved in this on the side of the Germans and Austro-Hungary. And then Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria together invades. In 1915, they invade Serbia. And they defeat Serbia. The Serbians have to escape through Albania and get out of their country. So Serbia was destroyed, defeated, and lot is happening over here. The Germans had a very powerful navy. They had pioneered undersea warfare. They had submarines called U-boats. They used to operate in wolf packs. And the British imposed a naval blockade on Germany. The Germans used submarines to fight the British Navy.
Wow.
Yeah. The Americans were supplying Britain with all kinds of materials, all kinds of foods, because there was a war going on. There was no means to produce all of that in Europe. So the Americans were supplying Britain with this. The Germans went into the Atlantic and they started sinking the American ships.
So America gets pulled into the war now.
So America protested. Then the Germans toned it down for some time. But then they saw that the British are being reinforced constantly by the Americans. So by 1916, 1917, the Germans again went all out and started attacking all these supply ships. Now, what happened here is that the Americans, they were helping the Allied powers through sending them arms, ammunition, and food. Because of this, the Allied powers, especially Britain, became heavily indebted to the Americans because they were buying all this on credit. And they would eventually have to pay it back. So eventually, the Americans got fed up of the German thing, and they also got involved in the war. Then the Americans got involved. They slowly entered the fray in Europe, and slowly the whole thing was shattered. The Ottomans surrendered. The Austria-Hungary Empire also surrendered, and eventually the Germans were made to surrender. There was a revolution in Russia in 1917. Two revolutions. In the first revolution, the Tsar was forced to abdicate and a provisional government came to power. They continued the war. Then there was a second revolution, a Bolshevik revolution, which eventually gave rise to the USSR. And after the Bolshevik revolution happened, they said we will not fight. So the lines were frozen on the eastern side. The Germans and the Russians, they signed an agreement, no more fighting. The Russians were able to concentrate on the west, but eventually they were defeated there. So then there was this armistice, the Treaty of Versailles, in which the Russians were not involved, the Germans were not involved. The Ottoman Empire was destroyed, divided into small pieces. Yeah, and there was a Turkish War of Independence that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk fought and won, because of which Turkey is one single country. Otherwise, it would have been broken into pieces. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dismantled. Austria came out of it, Hungary came out of it, various other states, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, and so much more was carved out of this Austro-Hungarian Empire. Germany lost lots of territory. The country of Poland was created out of this, and including some Russian possessions. The Germans were blamed solely for the entire war. They were made to pay very, very heavy reparations to the other powers which they had fought with. And this was a complete humiliation.
And a young Austrian soldier fought on the side of Germany.
Yes.
And that's where the seeds of World War II were planted.
Yes. So the Treaty of Versailles was a disastrous thing for Germany. Big humiliation. This man, Adolf Hitler, fought in the World War I. He carried that humiliation with him. The German army was reduced to 100,000 soldiers maximum. No more air force, and all kinds of restrictions were placed on Germany, right?
And the villain here for Germans was Big Daddy Britain back then, I'm assuming.
Yeah, Britain was the one that gained a lot out of this. Yeah, and so there were a number of powers, Britain, France, etc., who all were part of the Treaty of Versailles. And then something came out of this, which was the League of Nations, which was kind of the precursor to the UN. But the US was not part of it because the US Congress did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles or something. Now what happens is that in the post-war era, Germany is not destroyed because none of the fighting has happened on German soil. So they are able to restart their industries which were already going on. But because of the enormous reparations they have to pay every year, the economy is stuttering. The German mark becomes deeply devalued. Like it becomes like 1/1,000,000th of its original value. Hyperinflation. Yeah. Then the Americans even send loans to Germany to repay the reparations.
What was in store for America back then when World War I was happening? I'm sure there must have been some motivation to even take part in the war or to help Britain. It can't be as simple as, whatever, we were allies once upon a time. There's got to be some economic angle. They were the China of back then in some ways.
So the Americans are the original capitalists. Everything is money. They saw a great opportunity to make money, right? So they had this limitless land in which they produced all these crops like wheat and all that. So they sent lots of that to Europe to sustain the Allied forces and lots of arms and ammunition, weapons and all that. They sent to Britain and France and these countries, right? So they benefited a lot from this. They became the major economic power in the world after the end of World War I. By the time the World War ended, they were the major economic power in the world. And they had limitless resources, right? Then you had the German economy went down. There was hyperinflation. Then there was a Wall Street crash of 1929 in New York, in Wall Street. That caused ripples all over the world. And the German economy suffered a lot again because of that. In the 1920s, there was a rise of fascism in Italy. Benito Mussolini came to power. He quickly became a one-party dictator, that sort of thing. So there was this event happening here. In the 1930s, the National Socialist Party came to power in Germany because the government, the Weimar Republic government, was blamed for all the ills of the economy. So Adolf Hitler became the undisputed boss very rapidly. He broke the Treaty of Versailles. He started remilitarization, conscription, starting the production of new arms and air force and all that. And he went on this campaign against the Jews.
Yeah, I have to once again mention the iconic TRS line, which I think you had mentioned, and Joe Rogan's also mentioned it. We actually learned it from Joe Rogan. Tough times create hard men create easy times create soft men create tough times.
It's a cycle, never-ending cycle.
And within a span of 20 years, I'm guessing from World War I to World War II, there was this cycle that happened in Germany. Adolf Hitler, as evil as he is, and as bad as history tells us that he is, he was a tough man to rise as the single dictator in Germany. And I'd say the same probably for Mussolini.
Yes, so Italy felt humiliated. Italy felt it got nothing out of World War I. It had territorial ambitions. It wanted parts of the Balkans. It wanted territories in Africa. It had some, it wanted more. The Italians felt they got nothing out of the war, even though they bled so much against Austria. So there was this great discontent, which gave rise to nationalism, and the fascist party of Benito Mussolini came to power. Similarly, Germany was deeply humiliated. The people were hurt. Their pride was wounded. Nationalism again. And the strongman comes to power, Adolf Hitler, who promises that we will regain the world and we will regain our lost prestige and all that. And Hitler wanted territories. He wanted what he called Lebensraum, which is extra land for the German people. Right? So he wanted an expansion of Germany. So he restarted the conscription of the army. He restarted the military industries. He stopped payment of reparations. And Britain and France only protested weakly. They had weak governments. So he was further emboldened by this. Yes, I'm going to do it. So then the preparations again begin. So the Treaty of Versailles was nothing but a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire, a 20-year ceasefire. So Germany then becomes more and more powerful. The Nazi party also exists in Austria. So they come to power and they unify Austria and Germany. So Germany is now expanded. Now the Germans want Czech territory, Sudetenland or something they called it, in which you had a German majority population. So they had designs on that. The British and the French kind of allowed that. Okay, you go and do that, but please don't do more. So the Germans take that over. Then within no time, they go and take over half of Czechoslovakia. And the Slovak Republic becomes a vassal state or a satellite state of Germany. Then the Germans sign a no-aggression pact with Stalin. Hitler and Stalin. It was called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I think it was in 38 or 39. And the secret clause is that we will divide up Poland. So Poland was an independent country at the time. Then the Germans attack Poland. They take over half of it. The rest half is taken by the USSR. And then that is a declaration of war. Once they invade Poland, the British and the French declare war.
I just want to stop you here for a minute, sir. As a historian, when you're studying all these events, first of all, it's crazy how you remember all this and you're able to speak about all this, at the get-go. But I have to ask you, as a geopolitical observer also, do you study these events because of the times we live in? Is that the motivation for you to remember all this? Like, why do you study history so deeply?
I understand the times we live in because I've studied all this. It's the other way around. I was always curious about what happened in the past. I always, as a kid, I found that history is more interesting than fiction.
Okay.
There is so much happening, so many adventures, so many great personalities, so many disputes. And why do these disputes happen? I was interested in the causality. Why do things happen?
Let's go one level deeper. What's your answer to the why? Is it human psychology? Is it the feudal primal nature of human beings? Because these are patterns.
I think
that whole tough men, easy men thing is a pattern. So what is it according to you? What's the why?
Human history is very violent. We are a very violent species. Even our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, are just as violent as us. So we are by nature a violent species. Our entire history is a history of warfare. And these wars are typically driven by strong personalities who embody the nation, who say that I represent the pride of the nation, I will take our nation forward. And there is always a desire to gain more territory, more resources, which gives you more power and more control. And it embellishes, enhances your pride, your prestige, your people's prestige and all that. So it's always that sort of motivation at the deepest level. More territory, more prestige, more power, more control. I want to conquer the world. I want to be the king of the world. That sort of thing,
But in the modern day with the internet, do you think the nature of human beings or human motivation has changed? Because you don't think it's changed
Nothing has
at all?
changed. Nothing at all.
Okay. Do you think human beings are becoming better with time? Like, do you think the newer generation will be more gentle, or do we just follow historical patterns?
These are cycles. I mean, you go through cycles of great peace for a few decades, and then the human nature comes out again. Even in peacetime, if you see the social media and all that, people are fighting and sniping at each other. People do talk about compassion and peace and love and all that, and patience and progress, but those are a few random lone voices of reason. It would be great if we don't have war, but unfortunately, human nature is such that we are greedy. We want more. We are not satisfied. And when you have an army at your disposal, that greed takes a different form. You will actually act on it because you have that power. People who will obey you unquestioningly, that represents power. And when you have people like that, you will make them do what you want, what your people desire. And people always want more. So that's how it goes. Unfortunately, it's a cycle that never ends.
Yeah. I know this is very off topic and we primarily have non-Indian viewers, hopefully, for this podcast, but I still will bring in one Indian element from Vedanta. The Bhagawad Gita is basically a collection of the 4 Vedas. It's a kind of boiled down version of the Vedas. And the Vedas and ancient Indian knowledge speaks about our realm as the Bhulok, which is sort of a medium level planet where there's good and bad. The goal is to meditate and spiritually progress up to the point where your soul earns its nirvana or moksha and you become a Buddha and your soul leaves this planet. But to be able to get there from an evolutionary standpoint, it takes a lot of effort to break out of the maya or the simulation that this world is. And now when you put this in context right next to war, where such terrible things are happening, we've just begun talking about World War II, which in my study of history is probably the worst phase of human history. I don't know. Would you agree to that?
I agree, yes.
The worst things that have ever happened during World War II. It just makes you think of human nature. And while, yes, we might be a medium planet, like they say that there are heavenly planets and there are hellish planets and we're somewhere in the middle, sometimes narratives like World War II make you believe that we're not a middle planet, we're probably a hellish planet. But would you agree to that? I mean, what kind of evil does it take to burn up entire families, to ostracize an entire race of people? I don't know what kind of an internal evil it would take.
Joseph Stalin once said that a single death is a tragedy. 1 million deaths is a statistic. So when you are thinking at that scale, you stop thinking about the human element. You're thinking in terms of kilometers. You're thinking in terms of territory. You're thinking in terms of how much I have gained and how much I've lost. When you are governing a country of 100 million people, I think it happens to these people invariably that they stop thinking of the human cost of warfare. I mean, World War I was terrible. World War II was way worse than that. Horrific. The amount of human suffering that World War II saw was unimaginable. All kinds of brutalities, atrocities. And when you're sitting in an office and directing things, you don't see that. Right? And so you don't feel that. It doesn't hit you at a personal level. And I think people just disregard that.
Yeah, there's so many movies about World War II, and I'd love some recommendations before we actually head into this section of the podcast. World War I, there's not too many movies around it. 1917, have you watched it?
I haven't watched it yet.
Oh, so you should check it out.
Okay.
Like one of my teammates forced me to watch it, and it's one of the masterpieces in filming. It's a one-shot movie. It's shot as if, it's shot continuously.
Single take.
Yeah, single take movie. Incredibly done, but because it's one shot, makes you feel like you are placed in that World War I scenario. And it's so terrible. They've shown trenches. They've shown going into no man's land. Right. They've shown going from one part of the war land to another. And it just makes you question why a second World War would happen after these kind of atrocities. But then again, human nature.
Unfinished business. That's what it was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Go on, sir.
Where was I?
We were at the invasion of Poland. Would you like to recommend any movies before we move on? When it comes to World War II?
I think Saving Private Ryan was a good one, which kind of put you in the middle of the action. The first sequence itself is quite harrowing. The invasion of Normandy. Yeah. So that's one that I can remember off the top of my head. I've seen so many more. Many of them are old, like The Longest Day, The Purple Flame. There are lots of movies about this. But the one that immediately came to mind was Saving Private Ryan. Yeah.
The first movie I saw about World War II was The Great Escape.
The Great Escape, yes.
And
Sylvester Stallone, Pele, all those guys, right?
It was this really old movie. I think it was a 50s or 60s movie.
Yes.
And it's about concentration camps.
Yes.
It was about how one of the prisoners in a concentration camp escapes. It's like this whole heroic thing, but they've shown the reality of concentration camps back then.
Yes.
And there's so many narratives about World War II. It really makes you think about this whole concept of history being worse than fiction.
Yeah.
And this is fiction based on a historical event. What could reality have been? Then there's so many classified documents, like the whole Dr. Mengele angle, the Japanese experiments that were done on Chinese.
Yes.
This was the worst time in human history. And how did it begin?
So it begins with the German invasion of Poland. The Germans and the Soviets divide up Poland, roughly half. And that's when the declarations of war happened from the Allies. At the same time, Japan has been active in Asia. So the Japanese, in the 1930s, they conquered Manchuria, many parts of Manchuria. And then they had two options. There was one school of thought in the Japanese army that we should take the Eurasian part. I mean, they should go from the north. So take over Mongolia, take over parts of the USSR, the eastern part of the USSR, and go westwards from there. The other school of thought was go from Southeast Asia, from the sea route. So the Japanese fought in 1939, I believe. They fought first the Mongols, and then Mongolia was a satellite state of the USSR. So there were some border clashes in Mongolia. Then there was a clash between the Japanese army and the USSR army. The Japanese were defeated badly. So the entire thought of going from the north evaporated. The Japanese decided to go south. So they started conquering Southeast Asia.
Like the USSR, why do they always win these battles? Like, do they have a historic, kind of track record of being a winning nation?
The USSR wins because it has inexhaustible territory and they are willing to throw as many men as necessary into the battle.
There's that movie, right? Something about snipers. Enemy at the Gates.
Enemy at the Gates. Was it Stalingrad? I think it was Stalingrad.
I don't remember the exact thing, but they've shown this angle of just forcing the average Russian civilian into war.
Yes.
Like, go and if you turn back, we will shoot you.
I know.
That was, I think, the mentality.
Yes.
So basically, lots of natural resources, lots of land, and lots of human beings.
Lots of human beings. And the willingness to sacrifice as many people as required to win.
Strong nationalism.
So the Japanese, they took over, they started taking over Southeast Asia. Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, they came to the doorstep of India. So that's a different story that will come later. So the war happens in the Pacific also. It begins there, right? From Japan. They take over parts of China. There's a civil war going on in China this time. So they start taking over China, the eastern part of China. They do all kinds of atrocities in Nanjing and so on. There's a whole Asian angle to the war. Now coming back to Europe, the Germans and Soviets take over Poland. Then the Germans declare, so the British and the French declare war on Germany. USA is still not in this, right? Then the Germans, they do the same thing as they did in World War I. They go through Belgium and they punch through the French lines. They very rapidly take over Belgium and the Netherlands. The British have already landed in France. They are pushed back to Dunkirk, that movie Dunkirk, and then they are forced to evacuate from there. The Germans have a new strategy. It's an ancient Mongol strategy, but they call it blitzkrieg, lightning warfare. So they concentrate all their firepower in one point in the defenses of the opposite power, and they punch through it with lightning speed. They also have the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, massive, and the most modern Air Force in the world, the Germans.
I think we should sit on this topic a little bit. While war is all about atrocities, war is also about strategy. And any war strategy can often be applied in life as well. I'd love for you to break down Blitzkrieg a little bit and break down the power of the German Air Force, because I feel like that was a massive element of all the successes they gained during World War II.
So the Germans were always technologically advanced. They were innovators, right? So they developed a whole range of different airplanes. Stukas, Henkels, Messerschmitts, and these are some of the names that come to my mind. I've read this like when I was a kid. So they had all the most advanced aircraft, fighter aircraft for that time. And so that was one component of their military power. They had massive numbers of these airplanes. They had the most advanced tanks, the Panzer tanks for the time, very good tanks. So they had that, thousands of these tanks. And they had these strategies. The strategy was very clear. You are facing an enemy, you're facing fortifications. Don't diffuse your firepower. Don't strike at different places and try to punch many holes in the enemy's defenses. Concentrate all your firepower in one place, breach that wall, then just smash through it and advance at lightning speed. Hundreds of kilometers in a week. That's the kind of advance they wanted. And they achieved that.
What happens to the troops on the side?
They're left behind. And then they can be encircled from behind, outflanked and taken out. So that's the strategy they would use.
I think the business equivalent here is focus on one game at a time.
Focus on one game at a time. Focus on one problem at a time. Solve that. You have to see which is the weakest point in whatever problem you're attacking. Look at that and solve that. So there are a lot of parallels between warfare and business and life. The same strategies and tactics you use in warfare can very much be applied in business and in life. You just need to know how to adapt those tactics and strategies.
When you say in life, you mean people skills, right? Like in rooms, networking,
people skills, planning your next 10 years, planning your next 5 years. What are the problems you're facing? The personal problems you're facing, the business problems you're facing, people problems you're facing. Everything is applicable in real life.
Keeping that in mind, let's also talk about Adolf Hitler, sir. There has to be a reason this person rose to power.
Yeah.
Taking away nothing from the atrocities committed by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis during World War II, I just want to touch upon the possibility of there being an alternative history that we're not taught in history books. And I think you're the right person to ask this to. Do you have a different, possibly controversial take on Adolf Hitler and his atrocities, or what we are taught in textbooks based on your own research? Or do you think that he's as bad as our textbooks portray him to be?
See, I don't think he's worse than Stalin or Mao. Stalin ended up killing more people than Adolf Hitler. Mao Zedong killed way more people than Adolf Hitler. Winston Churchill killed more Indians than Adolf Hitler killed Jews. But we demonize Adolf Hitler, and we kind of, even in India, worship Winston Churchill because we're not taught the truth. So there's always shades of gray, and it's not all black and white. Of course, Hitler was evil. Of course, he was a monster. But he was not the biggest monster. He was not the biggest shark in the pond. Churchill was worse. He was brutal. He was a Hinduphobe. He was an Indophobe. He killed so many Bengalis and he siphoned off the wheat that India was producing, which should have gone to Bengal, and he sent it to Greece. And Mao Zedong killed way more people later on during his career in China. Stalin killed way more people than Hitler, but we demonize Hitler. I'm not saying we should not demonize Hitler, but he was small fry compared to these other people, actually. Right? So that's an interesting perspective we from India can see, and the West won't talk about it. My other perspective is that if Hitler had fought on the side of the US, today the Nazis would be the most stylish people in the world. Look at the uniforms, how stylish they are. I think it was Hugo Boss probably that designed the Nazi uniforms. Today that style is frowned upon because it evokes the Nazi era. But had Hitler allied with the US, today he would be regarded as some great hero. The winners always write history, and they portray things the way they want them to.
We had Anuj Dhar on the Hindi podcast. You've also had him on your show, I believe, who's dedicated his entire life to studying Subhash Chandra Bose. And he spoke about how hiding Subhash Chandra Bose's life, as in telling the public that he's actually died, or even when we speak about Mahatma Gandhi, like we did on the last Hindi podcast. Mahatma Gandhi is celebrated, though he very likely committed a lot of wrongs that are not reported in India or the rest of the world. Why is this? According to you, it's because of geopolitical intentions. There are powerful people in powerful places that don't want the general public to know the truth about Mahatma Gandhi. I would highly recommend you check out the Hindi podcast if you haven't already for more on this topic. But sir, I want to ask you that what post the war, okay? And of course, we'll get back to the events and all that, but post the war, why did they paint Hitler as badly as they did? Why has he become the face of evil in human history? There has to be some geopolitical angle here as well.
See, the world, the past 400-500 years has been dominated by a single category of people, the Anglo-Saxons, the English-speaking empire, so to say. The British Raj, the British Empire was clearly an empire. After World War II got over, the headquarters of the Anglo-Saxon Empire shifted from London to Washington, D.C., but the empire remained the same. So it's a single, today you call it a superpower, but it's nothing but an empire. They have their dominion all over the world. So the empire has never died. The empire still exists. And they dominate the narrative, and they dominate everything that we understand about the world. So because Hitler fought against their empire, that's why they have to portray him as an evil person. I'm not saying he was not evil. Of course he was evil. He killed 6 million Jews or whatever the number is, and gypsies. But had he fought on their behalf, they would not have said the same thing. Because there are so many other dictators that they have worked with. You know, there's this saying, I think it was Henry Kissinger who said this, that guy may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. So we don't talk bad about our people, even though they might be doing the worst atrocities possible.
Like Winston Churchill.
Winston Churchill, for instance, and various other dictators in Africa, in South America, Latin America, and other parts of the world. Saddam Hussein was an American creature for the longest time, until the Americans felt that they had no more use for him. And then they went to war against him, and so on. So this is a pattern that happens again and again and again in this context.
A big part of war is writing media narratives about the enemy.
Propaganda is very, very important, extremely important.
Which is what we see with Zelensky and the whole Putin angle.
See, media is just propaganda. Especially when it comes to Western media, they are only repeating the state-approved perspective. The freedom of speech is okay as long as you say what they want you to say. Western media is very monochromatic. I'm talking about the English-speaking media, even the various countries that are now part of the US-led bloc. Germany is a US vassal state. It's under US occupation since World War II. Japan has been under US occupation since 1945. It is still under permanent US occupation. Same goes for South Korea and so on. So the perspectives you see there are the sanitized, state-approved perspectives. That's how it is. We don't realize that. We think there's freedom of speech and all that. No, that's not quite the case.
Let's dial back again to the timeline we were on, which is Hitler. And I do believe that we need to speak about two people in particular. The first is Hitler and this whole Aryan theory, where it originates from. Because again, the Indian context is, didn't he have sort of a tiny pact with Subhash Chandra Bose as well? Then that's against the Aryan theory, that they were racist. Again, I'm not defending the Aryan theory or racism. I condemn it as much as you do. An offended viewer I'm speaking to. But I want to dig a little bit deeper. Is this propaganda? Do you think the Aryan theory was an actual thing? Why did they use an Indian swastika to represent this? What's your take on this whole racism angle?
So if you want to come to power as a nationalist, you have to create a mythology around yourself. a mythology around yourself and your people. You have to convince the people that you are superior. You have been wronged, and I am the guy who will right the wrongs. That's how you come to power. So that's the classic strategy that Hitler used. So he needed a big symbol for his political orientation, for his ideology and all that. So he chose the Hakenkreuz, which is the hooked cross. The German word for that symbol is the Hakenkreuz, the hooked cross. It is not the Indian swastika. It is not the sacred swastika. It is only after the war that the British and the Americans attached the Sanskrit word swastika to the Hakenkreuz. In Europe, across the world, the swastika has always been a symbol of positivity. It's a very ancient symbol. The French called it the Gamadian. The British called it the Fiflot. The Germans called it the Hakenkreuz, and so on and so forth. There were lots of local names for the symbol. It is an ancient Indo-European symbol. And even in Africa, you find it. Even in the Americas, the Native American traditions, you find the swastika. Even in Japan.
What does it represent?
It represents auspiciousness. It's a symbol of auspiciousness and positivity. It's a holy, sacred symbol. You see the swastika anywhere in India, it's a good thing, right? And similarly in Japan, if you go to Japan today, if you go to Google Maps and you search for Shinto temples or Buddhist temples on the map in Japan, they will be marked with swastikas, even today. You go to Mongolia, the swastika is an extremely holy symbol. Go to China, it always was, before the communist era, a holy symbol. All across Southeast Asia, all across the world. The Nazis under Hitler took that symbol, which they called the Hakenkreuz, the twisted reverse hooked cross, and they started using it as their party symbol, the Nazi party. The National Socialist Party, their symbol became that black, twisted, ulta swastika on a red background. So that is the thing. Now they also took another, they hijacked another Sanskrit term, the Arya term. So Arya in Indian culture means a noble person, a person with good qualities, a civilized person. The Iranians, who are offshoots of ancient Indians, they made it an ethnic term. They said, we are the Arya people, we are the Aryans. And Indians and Iranians, if any ethnic group can call themselves the Arya people, it is the Indians and the Iranians, nobody else. But this guy Hitler, he said that we are the true Aryans. The Aryan invasion myth comes into this fake thing that everything came from Europe, right? So he said that the whiter you are, the more Aryan you are. And we Germans are the supreme master race. We are the true Aryans, us and the Nordic people. That's it. So he created this mythology that he fed the German people, that we are the master race, we are the superior race. We should be ruling the world. We have been wronged in the past. And I am the man who will take Germany out of all this, and we will be supreme again. So that was the mythology he created. And that's the whole Aryan controversy. Today, if you go to the West, you cannot even speak the word Aryan because it means Nazi. And you cannot display a swastika even though it's a symbol of auspiciousness, because it only has one connotation, the wrong connotation.
It's become a symbol of white supremacy also.
All of that. Because people who still worship Hitler, they'll have Nazi, the Hakenkreuz tattooed. You see lots of people in Ukraine with those tattoos today.
Really?
Absolutely.
And it's for the same reason?
That is white supremacy.
Okay.
They believe in Nazism. Ukraine is being currently denazified by Shri Putin. So the Western audience may not like to hear that, but that's what's happening. So there is a very strong Nazi element in Ukraine, which dates back to the 1930s and 1940s. Which is the period we're talking about.
And this is based on geographical expansion of the Nazi party?
It is because the Ukrainians in Western Ukraine identified with white supremacy, identified with the Nazi ideology. They unleashed horrific pogroms on the gypsies, especially on the Jews. There were horrific atrocities in Ukraine. Stefan Bandera, that we spoke about in the past, he was one of the great heroes of that time. Ukrainian Nazi-leaning nationalist. So there's a whole deep, dark history over there.
I also have to briefly ask you about Hirohito. Because, again, our textbooks don't talk about the atrocities of the Japanese Empire from back then. The only place I've got to know about Japanese atrocities in World War II is the internet.
Yes.
And my assumption is that because Japan became friendly with the US post the war, some of that stuff is erased from history books. But they've done a lot of shit. So do you want to shed light on some of that?
Certainly. So that's a very interesting chapter of history. The Japanese broke with their culture in the 19th century. They saw that the Western powers were so much more advanced than anything they had. Technologically advanced. They had all these ships. They had these commercial networks, trade routes, and all that. And the Japanese emperor of that time, the Meiji emperor, he aspired to make Japan an imperial power in the mold of the Western powers. So Japan's culture is a syncretic mix of native Shinto traditions and Indian Buddhist traditions. If you look at the actual Japanese literature about Shinto, it's more like Japanese Hinduism, very similar. And Buddhism is obviously something that came from India. So their culture is founded on a bedrock of Indian culture. It's the same moral values and all that. Non-violence, peace, tolerance, respect, all those things, compassion, all those things. And they had a Japanese Kshatriya class called the samurais. They were also warlords, the shoguns and all that. So there's a whole period of that in Japanese history. Now, the Meiji restoration or reformation, which happened in the 19th century, attempted to eradicate Buddhism from Japan. They said it's a foreign import, we don't want it, and they destroyed the samurai class. Totally destroyed the samurai class. So they were able to destroy the samurai class, but they failed in eradicating Buddhism. It is still there. Now, what happened? Even then, what they succeeded is they succeeded in deracinating the Japanese military and the Japanese elite from traditional Japanese culture. And they imbibed everything that came from the West. So they remolded Japan as an imperialistic, expansionist power, just the way the Western countries were.
This is one family.
Yeah, it is the Japanese imperial family that was at the forefront of doing all this. So quickly, all of this happened. The Japanese military became bloodthirsty, expansionist. The Japanese, when the Chinese talk about the century of humiliation, right? The opium wars and all that. The Japanese also demanded similar concessions from the Chinese, just like the Western powers were doing. They also demanded territory. They captured territory. And the Western powers, the British and the Americans, were very impressed with the Japanese. Oh, how civilized they are. They're behaving just like us. So the Japanese, they broke from the tradition. They became an amoral, mercantilist, expansionist power in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century. That continued into World War I. They fought with the Russians. They expanded into Manchuria post-World War I. And in World War II, they took the side of Germany. And then they went on this rampage across Eastern Asia. So they had become completely immoral, and they displayed no compassion.
I think they were also extremely fascinated by early forms of bio-warfare.
Yeah.
Like when we talk about Dr. Mengele in the concentration camps and all his experiments on human beings, basically torture. The Japanese side, they also had their own forms of torture, where plague-infested rats were thrown on prisoners, and I think people were injected with pathogens and things like that.
They had all kinds of horrific experiments that they conducted on human beings. The exposure of human beings to extreme cold. How long can a human being survive in that kind of cold until the heart stops? Those times they would measure at different temperatures. Horrific experiments. At the end of World War II, the Americans took all the data.
How Hirohito, Mussolini and Adolf Hitler had a sort of pact.
Yes.
And that's why they were branded as the fascist powers.
The Axis powers.
The Axis powers. But the ideology was fascism.
The ideology was, they all had different ideologies.
Okay.
Even Stalin and Hitler, they had this Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. The Nazis were very much anti-communism, anti-Marxism, but there was an alliance of convenience before the World War began.
Geopolitical lesson that there's no actual friendships, it's just conveniences.
Absolutely. So Hitler and Stalin were on the same page for some time. Hitler and Mussolini were aligned because they all had grievances which were left over from World War I. The Japanese in World War I had allied with the British. This time they allied with the Axis powers, with Germany and Japan. So the Axis powers were three: Germany, Japan, and Italy. For some time, Stalin was on the side of Hitler because they had divided up Poland together in the very beginning of the war. So now the Americans imposed an oil and steel blockade on the Japanese because they were expanding so fast. They tried to choke that. In retaliation, the Japanese, after some time, they said, we have to take some action. They attacked Pearl Harbor in a massive bombardment, aerial bombardment.
Tora.
That's right. So that significantly damaged the American Pacific fleet that was stationed at Pearl Harbor. The Americans had no option but to enter the fray, declare war on the Japanese and on the Axis powers. But it took them a few months to repair the fleet and actually get going in this. So that's what happened there. The Japanese were expanding in East Asia. Now, there's a lot of action happening in Europe. The Germans very rapidly overtook France. They took Paris. The southern half of they took over northern France and western France, and the southern half of France was under the Vichy government, which was kind of a puppet state of the Nazis. Other parts of Europe very quickly fell to the Nazis. Yugoslavia, the Balkan region, and further south, Italy was already anyway part of their alliance. There was action in North Africa also. The Italians took over Ethiopia. They had some possessions there. Then the Germans also got involved in North Africa. That's a whole different story. After the whole of Europe was taken over, the Germans had complete control over over all of Europe, the Germans and the Italians. Then they started attacking the British. The Battle of Britain, aerial warfare. You know, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe against the Royal Air Force with their Spitfires and all those things. So there were these massive aerial battles, bombardments on both sides. The Germans started using cruise missiles, the V1 and the V2 cruise missiles. The V2 was a ballistic missile, the V1 was a cruise missile.
What is it?
The V1 was the first use of jet engines in combat, in warfare. So it was a plane kind of thing with a single jet engine that could be targeted at a long distance at a certain city or certain location. So they would hit cities like London and other major places in Britain with these V1 missiles. Eventually they deployed the V2 ballistic missile that would go into outer space and then come back on a parabolic ballistic trajectory. So the Germans are the pioneers of missiles, cruise missiles as well as ballistic missiles. That technology was then taken over later after the war by the Americans and the Soviets. That's later. So there was a Battle of Britain. The Germans, Hitler wanted to take over Britain. But eventually, for some reason, he gave up on that for some time and he decided to invade the USSR. 1941, Operation Barbarossa. So he had this massive army, the Wehrmacht. And they went on 3 separate directions to the east in the USSR. Stalin was kind of caught napping. He knew in principle the war is coming, even though we are kind of allies. He knew in principle. But he was taken by tactical surprise. He thought that there would first be some diplomatic hostilities before the actual war breaks out. That did not happen. There was a straight invasion by the Germans. So there was this AA line. The Germans had created something called the AA line, which was from Arkhangelsk in the north, in the White Sea, to Astrakhan in the Caspian Sea. They wanted to capture the entirety of Russia until that line. So one German army went south, one went towards Moscow, one went north. And that was massively successful. They used the same strategy, blitzkrieg, punching through the Russian defenses, massively successful. And they started making significant progress. Hundreds of kilometers in a week, that sort of thing. Right? So the Russians were falling back. They lost massive amounts of territory. But there was a major disaster in the German intelligence. In the first 3-4 months, the Russians lost about 3 million soldiers. 30 lakh soldiers vanished, all killed. And yet they had armies. The Germans thought that the Russians would have another 2-3 million in reserve. What they did not know that the Russians had about 14-15 million trained reserves, an inexhaustible supply of men. They were trained, they knew how to fight. The strategies and tactics weren't great because there were all these purges in Soviet Russia in which many of the top generals were killed off. But yet...
By who?
By Stalin.
Oh, by Stalin?
By Stalin himself.
Because they were probably saying we don't want to go to war.
Because he was paranoid and he wanted to reform or revise or whatever the army. He wanted to get rid of anybody who could be a threat to him in the future. So he killed off uncountable numbers of people in the 1930s. So the top ranks of the Red Army were depleted. So you did not have good leadership. But what Stalin did is that he issued a call to every soldier to fight for Rossiya Matushka, Mother Russia. You're not fighting for Stalin, you're fighting for your motherland. So these Russians, they fought like anything. They died in the millions, but they just kept coming. The Russian Wehrmacht made massive advances. North, east and south. Then Hitler made a call. He said, stop the advance on Moscow and reinforce the push southwards, because he wanted to capture Ukraine, where there's so many resources. Ukraine is a resource-rich territory. So he pushed towards Ukraine and he temporarily stopped the march on Moscow. So that went for some time. The German advance was very successful. Eventually, they restarted the advance on Moscow. They reached within 20 kilometers of Moscow. But the Russians just kept coming. They just kept fighting. They fought, they died, and they just kept coming. 14 to 15 million reserves. That is the value of having a reserve force. So eventually, by the end of 1941, the Germans had come to the gates of Moscow, but they were ground to a halt there. And then the autumn happened and the winter happened, and the skies opened up, and everything. There was first rain, mud everywhere. The tanks wouldn't go forward. The armies were bogged down, and then the Russian winter, minus 30 degrees. The Germans froze. So people say, many historians say that the Germans lost, the operation failed because of the Russian winter. Actually, the Germans froze because they had lost to the Russian army. It is the Russian army that defeated the Germans, not the winter. The punishment was the freezing due to the winter, because they lost to the Russian army. That's what happened.
There's so many leadership, business, warfare, strategy lessons in each of these battles. I think that's why World War II has been such a fascinating subject for so many people who say, oh, I love war strategy, I love books on war. It's actually these things that each country, each empire had its own style of fighting.
Yes.
And there's stuff to learn from everyone. Like from Russia, it's kind of like the Indian cricket team. You have a steady supply of batsmen.
Never give up. Fight. And inexhaustible supply of manpower. And a vast territorial advantage. Inexhaustible amounts of land.
Which is why, even in the modern day, China probably wants to expand as much as they do, because they're prepping for the future. If you have a lot of land in your hands, you're probably a more powerful nation.
Yes, absolutely.
And which is why most of these countries always think with an expansionist mindset. We think imperialism is done, but America is also constantly in an expansionist mindset. Because if you stay the same, you'll probably go down. You won't go forward.
Yes.
You have to think about going ahead. Okay, so go on.
So Operation Barbarossa failed. In 1942, there was another advance by the Germans down south towards the Caucasus region. The Battle of Stalingrad, which is in that movie Enemy at the Gates. There was another disastrous siege where was horrific for the civilians. In the 1941 offensive, there was this terrible battle for Leningrad, St. Petersburg, which lasted 870 days. More than 1 million civilians died. But eventually the Germans were pushed back. So the Soviets, the Russians, they paid the price for the defense of their country with oceans of blood. But they did not give up.
What was happening in Europe while Germany was trying to expand into Russia? Was there complete Nazi control?
Complete Nazi control, complete Axis control, all of Europe. All of Europe. Yugoslavia, there was a resistance going on. In later Yugoslavia, there was this guy called Marshal Tito, who was spearheading a resistance against Nazi occupation. There was some of that in Greece also. There was a war going on in North Africa also, in Eastern Africa also, in Northeast Africa. And there was the Battle of Britain going on. Means the Germans were trying to constantly bombarding Britain. The British were responding with aerial raids on German territories, on Berlin. So there's a whole lot going on. But Hitler, for some reason, he put off the invasion of Britain and tried to invade the USSR.
Which was the mistake.
Which was a massive mistake. The Eastern Front was frozen. They had a non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Soviets were not going to invade or attack Germany. If he had gone ahead and destroyed or captured the UK, it was game over. The empire that ruled the world would have fallen. But for some reason, he moved his focus eastwards. That was the major mistake that Hitler made. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just a cold academic observation, strategic observation. If he had continued with his assault on Britain and had he succeeded, the war would have ended there. Then he could have taken over the USSR at his leisure over a longer period of time. But he was maddened by greed, I think.
Now, what I want to ask you is about the mistake. What do you think is the learning for modern day history lovers from this World War II situation where he could have won the entire war, because if you kill the king, the entire chessboard falls. So he could have just gone into Britain, taken it over, probably taken over the entire empire. I'm assuming, maybe that's a little soft geopolitical analysis, but could have been a possibility.
He could have made the empire disintegrate. He could possibly have taken over if he had not, just by decapitating the very top. See, when you do a coup, in a coup d'etat, you don't destroy the whole country. You just take out the top leadership and put your own thing there, and then you control the whole organism. That's how we do it. So if he had achieved that sort of thing in the UK, he might conceivably, perhaps, taken over the entire British Empire if he had succeeded in that. But for whatever reason, he decided to put that off and concentrate on the USSR, which was a massive mistake. The major enemy for him, the immediate enemy for him, was the UK. It was the only power left undefeated in Europe. And he made the mistake of turning back from there. Maybe the resistance he faced was more than he anticipated. So he thought, okay, let me go and grab something that's easier to take, which ended up being much worse for him.
So the mistake was greed, basically.
The mistake was greed, and maybe he deferred biting the bullet of taking the UK.
What was happening in India and all these colonies at this time? They were just supplying people to the war, nothing else.
Endless supply of people. I think more than 1.5 million Indian troops fought in World War II. Maybe more. Definitely over 1 million. And so India was involved, Africa was involved, all these different territories were involved. There was fighting in Asia as well. The Japanese were advancing towards India. They wanted to take out India. They wanted to capture India from the British, the jewel of the crown.
How do you think the Japanese would have been as a ruler of India?
Maybe just as barbaric as the British were. The British were absolutely barbarians. We don't realize that because we are taught a very sanitized version of history. In the aftermath of 1857, they killed over 10 million Indians in just a few years. That is a horrific number. And the number of Indians they killed in engineered famines exceeds 100 million. That's what the British did from the 1700s until the 1940s. More than 100 million people, Indians, were killed. Innocent men, women, children were starved to death deliberately by the British. So the British were the epitome of barbarism, even though they pretend to be very classy and all that. The Japanese could possibly have been just as barbaric because we know what they did, their track record in Asia, expanding towards India, westwards. We know the kind of horrific atrocities they perpetrated in China, in Nanjing, in Indonesia, in other places. Absolutely horrific. So the same thing could have happened conceivably in India had they captured India as well. Now that brings us to the angle of Subhash Chandra Bose. Subhash Chandra Bose was an Indian nationalist. He wanted to overthrow the British by force. He knew that if we take independence on the terms of the British, we are not truly independent. We are still colonized, which is what happened eventually. So he said, my enemy's enemy is my friend. The British are my enemy, so I'll fight. I will try and ally with whoever is fighting against the British. So he first went to Germany. He met Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler referred him to Japan. He said that you are closer to Japan, so why don't you go to Japan? I will give you my reference, my recommendation, and you can meet the Japanese, whoever is in charge. Hideki Tojo, I think. So Subhash Chandra Bose went to Japan all the way by submarine and various other ways. And he was able to impress the Japanese, and he was able to acquire Japanese help. So what they gave him was material support, and they gave him charge of all the Indian prisoners of war, the British Indian prisoners of war, which he then converted into the Indian National Army, INA, right? And then Subhash Chandra Bose he participated in the Japanese attempt to conquer India. So there were multiple victories against the British through Burma, etc. And Subhash Chandra Bose's INA came all the way into India, Eastern India, Imphal, the Battle of Imphal and the Battle of Kohima. From there, the INA was driven back and defeated. So there were these terrible battles at Imphal and Manipur, which went on for months. The British bombarded civilians in Imphal, even in Kohima. Innocent Indians were killed, innocent men, women, children. And there was this terrible battle outside Imphal, the Battle of Red Hill. So there were these terrible battles. Eventually, the Japanese and the INA were pushed back. And once they were pushed back from India, the disaster began for them. And they were pushed back all the way. And slowly, the tide turned in Asia.
Coming back to the linear narrative again, sir. So basically, Hitler goes for Russia, gets extremely weakened. I'm assuming this is where Big Daddy USA becomes Big Daddy USA. What's the Saving Private Ryan thing called? D-Day.
Yeah, D-Day. So the US got involved first because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So the initial US campaign began in the Pacific Islands, Guadalcanal, and they started this policy of island hopping. Capture one island, go to the next island, capture that. And eventually they wanted to take over Japan. Then they also got involved in Europe, obviously, because once you go to war with all the Axis powers. So Germany experienced a disaster in Operation Barbarossa in 1941. They could not take over USSR. They were greatly weakened. Then there was a landing. Which one happened first? I think there was a landing from North Africa into Sicily. So the Allied powers took over the Sicilian island, the island of Sicily in Italy. From there, they hopped into the southern part of Italy, and they took over some portion of southern Italy. The Italian government asked for a ceasefire. The Germans then invaded Italy, and there were atrocities in Italy, also in Greece. Then there was an invasion. The Germans had fortified the entire Atlantic coast of Europe. Massive fortifications, massive machine gun nests, cannons and all that. And they were anticipating that there could be an invasion from the UK, which is still independent, which is still free. And that's what happened. Was it 41? Was it 42? Whichever year it is, the invasion of Normandy, right? Which is depicted in Saving Private Ryan. So a massive invasion force, probably the biggest naval invasion force ever assembled till then. It crossed the English Channel and landed on the beaches of Normandy, where a previous 1,000 years ago, the Vikings used to raid, right? So they landed on the beaches of Normandy, massive casualties, but they were able to take a portion of the beach. And from there, they started expanding into France. That's where the tide turns because of the American presence. The Americans send lots of troops, ammunition, arms, all of that. That bolsters the Allied cause. They start taking over parts of France. The tide turns over there. And slowly, to make things shorter, they were able to liberate France. Italy eventually was liberated. Belgium, Netherlands. The USSR then was, we know in 41 they were beating Germany. Then they started expanding westwards, the USSR. So the Americans essentially liberated France, Americans and British. But the USSR liberated all of Eastern Europe from the Nazis. Eventually in 1945, they were on the outskirts of Berlin. Hitler shot himself. And
that's what's told to us.
Yes, that's what told to us. We don't know what actually happened, but we've never seen the body or whatever. In the pictures, we are told that he committed suicide. He shot himself. His wife took a poison pill or whatever. And that's how the story goes, the official narrative.
Let's dial back again and go on a tangent again. Maybe it could be a very tiny tangent. In the same way that we can learn strengths from the different countries. Is USA's strength money? Was money the reason they were actually able to be a part of the winning side? Money and probably being shrewd.
The real reason the US has been so dominant is because they are untouchable. They have a vast expanse of ocean on each side. And they are the only power in the Americas, in North America as well as South America. Geopolitics. South America is constantly under strife. There's always drug wars going on, dictatorial regimes coming and going. Who engineers all this behind the scenes?
Damn, son.
Even in North America, Canada is essentially a puppet state of the US. Mexico, well, it's not a threat in any kind. More than half of Mexico is now part of the US. Texas was a Mexican territory. California was a Mexican territory. The Americans fought a war with the Mexicans and took over massive amounts of territory. They are the undisputed number one, the only power in the Americas. On the western side, or to the west of America, they have the massive Pacific Ocean. Nobody can reach them. To the east, they have the Atlantic Ocean. Nobody can reach them. And they have an entire continent-sized piece of land. Inexhaustible resources and no threats at all. And then they indebted the whole of Europe in World War I, World War II. And then they built up a massive military and eventually took over the entire reins of the empire which the British had built.
One quick question for you. This is a geopolitical question. A very experienced sailor had once told me that oceans are actually at the center of geopolitics. What is the logic behind this? Is it because oceans supply food to growing economies? Is that the logic? Is it, naval pathways? What's the scene?
Oceans are the home of the trade routes and the commercial routes.
And whoever controls logistics can actually win a war.
You have access to energy oil.
Okay.
How does oil flow? Through tankers. That goes through the various choke points. And 90% of the world's trade happens through the seas. You control that, you control everything. That is the major reason why the oceans are critical to geopolitics. And the various choke points like the Suez Canal, like the Straits of Gibraltar, the Turkish Straits, the Malacca Strait, the Sunda Strait, the Strait of Hormuz, the various degree channels and the Lakshadweep Islands and the Andaman Islands, these are extremely critical to geopolitics. India controls two massive choke points. The whichever degree channel it is in the Lakshadweep Islands, and similarly one in the Andaman Islands. India also overlooks the Malacca Strait and the Strait of Bab al-Mandeb and the Strait of Hormuz. So India is in a God-given geographical position to control all of this. If only India would grow up a little bit. So that's why the oceans are central to geopolitics, to control of all the trade routes and the energy routes, energy supplies.
Even back in the 1940s, this is the reason US...
The past 500 years, it's been central to geopolitics.
Maybe the lesson here is that winning also is because of some luck in some cases.
You control these trade routes, you will have constant supply to all the resources that you need. So if somebody manages to cut it off, you will choke. So if somebody were to cut off the Suez Canal, the UK would have dried out and they would have lost had they not been supplied by the US. So they used to call the Suez Canal the spinal cord of the British Empire. It gave them access to India. You cut that off, it's over. They will lose access to India. So these geographical choke points are vital to geopolitics, and the oceans are vital because of these reasons.
I still feel there's like a list of things to be learned from America.
Yes.
Probably a playbook that China is using in the modern day. Firstly, be rich and be capitalistic. That's the primary one for me, because I mean, to even build futuristic weapons, you need money.
So the Chinese, they learned the debt trap diplomacy from the Americans.
What is that?
The debt trap. What the Chinese do is that they offer funds to various small countries. Sri Lanka, for instance.
Okay.
Massive amounts of loans they give, but at very high rates, predatory rates. So then they will convince whatever dictator is running the country to take the massive loan, take some cut out of it, and accept very high interest rates. After 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, the country will not be able to pay back the loan. Then you can take over the country in various ways. Take over some ports and all that, strategic locations. So that is the textbook debt trap diplomacy, which they use in Africa, in Sri Lanka, and other places. The origin of that is essentially the US actions in World War I and World War II. The entirety of Western Europe was indebted to the Americans. And they could not escape that because the debt was too high. I think the UK is still paying off the debt.
Of World War I.
Of World War II.
Wow. Maybe at the end of this one, let's talk about the final events of World War II. Beginning with what we spoke about Hitler. There are conspiracy theories according to which he actually escaped to South America. I think it was Argentina, if I'm not mistaken, because later on they found a lot of Nazis operating out of Argentina. I think even Mengele was found in Argentina. But I'm sure Mengele couldn't have been alone. If Mengele was able to escape to Argentina, I am dead sure someone with the power that Hitler held had to have escaped there.
Yes, lots of Nazis were able to escape to South America, especially Argentina. One of the most famous cases was Adolf Eichmann, who was eventually in the 1960s captured by a Mossad team in Argentina and transported all the way back to Israel.
We've not even touched upon Israel in this entire conversation.
Yes.
But anyway, go on, sir.
Yeah, if you want to talk about Israel, that goes back to World War I. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 or so. That's a whole different tangent.
I think Israel is a whole other podcast, including what they're doing geopolitically now, etc. But I think in this one, we'll just stick to World War II. Keeping that conspiracy theory in mind, what do you believe? Again, keeping all your data points in mind.
I believe there is a significant paucity of information about Hitler. Whatever we have been told is very fragmentary, it's not convincing. It's not enough to prove that he died. Where's the evidence? We don't have a single image, a photograph of the dead body in case he had died, right? I mean, that's the first evidence we look for. There are so many Nazi criminals who died, who were hanged, who shot themselves. We have the photographic evidence of all these things. But there's no evidence of Hitler ever found. They say the Soviets took his body and they burned it or whatever. Well, the Soviets would have wanted to photograph that thing, that we were the ones who were able to acquire his body. right? We are the ones who induced his suicide. It would be the greatest triumph for Stalin to show that, but it never happened. Why didn't it did not happen? So there is clearly an element that would tell you that maybe something else happened. And we know that after the war, lots of Nazis, officers and soldiers and all, they escaped via various routes to Argentina, to South America, and they lived there for decades. Many of them lived peacefully and died out over there. So it is possible, it's conceivable that even Hitler may have been part of that exodus to South America. It's possible.
What was the Mossad angle? It's like very Gangs of Wasseypur, taking revenge way after the events.
The Mossad, one of their objectives was to seek out, smoke out all the Nazis who had escaped and who were living peaceful lives and who had not paid for the crimes they had committed during World War II, especially against the Jewish people. So the the Mossad had these spies all across Europe, and they eventually got wind of the fact that there were many Nazis living in Argentina. They were even able to locate Mengele. But they had a choice, Eichmann or Mengele. That's what I believe the choice was. And they went for Eichmann.
Who gave them the choice?
I think there was the question of exfiltration. You have to kidnap a person who is now an Argentinian citizen, possibly protected by the Argentinian government.
Possibly protected by the American government.
Possibly protected by somebody else. Yeah, possibly, yeah. So you have to do this under the nose of the Argentinian government. And before they can get wind of what happened, you have to exfiltrate that person in some way out of the country. So you can't do it with lots of people. You capture one person, then the government will become alert that everybody else is under danger. So they had only one shot. So then they decided to take out Eichmann instead of Mengele.
Why Eichmann instead of Mengele? Did he do worse shit than Mengele?
Most likely he did worse shit than Mengele. Possibly. That's a call they took, and they took out Eichmann. The story of how they captured him is incredible. I mean, I think there are books written about that. So that's a very interesting story. So that's what the Israelis did. But we know that the Nazis, lots of Nazis were living in Argentina. I think there are movies made about this. There is even one Marvel movie, Majan, I don't know which it was, in which there's a scene of this guy going to Argentina and shooting a couple of Nazis. So yeah, it's been well known that the Nazis went there. Lots of Nazis settled down over there. It's conceivable that even Adolf Hitler, maybe he did not die. Maybe he also went there, shaved off his mustache, changed his hairstyle, something. Who knows? It's possible.
And the final rung, the atom bombs.
Yes. So in the 1940s, the Americans were developing the atom bomb, the Manhattan Project.
Nolan's making a movie on it.
Is it?
Christopher Nolan's making a movie on the Manhattan Project.
Right.
Like about the whole moral dilemma of like throwing an atom bomb on human beings, etc.
I see. Right. So lots of nuclear physicists were involved in this. The brightest minds that the Americans had. Enrico Fermi, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and many other people. The theoretical work was done earlier by people like Einstein and all that. Yeah, the basic theoretical foundations of nuclear fission and all that. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to harvest nuclear fission, harvest it, and create a chain reaction that will essentially liberate enormous amounts of energy, which is a nuclear bomb. Eventually, they were able to do that. The Trinity test in the desert somewhere in the southern part of the US. So there was this feeling that maybe the Germans are also pursuing a similar program, but it looks like they were not. So the Americans were racing towards the bomb. Then they were able to test the bomb in the Trinity test. Then they made 2 of these bombs. Fat Man and Little Boy or something like that. Yeah. So the Japanese were driven back in Asia. Eventually, all they had was parts of Manchuria and the Japanese islands themselves. The Americans, after the Germans lost, after the Germans surrendered, the Americans launched an intense bombardment campaign on Japan. The Soviets took over the Sakhalin Peninsula, the Sakhalin region. They took over the Kuril Islands. They came all the way to Hokkaido, which is the northernmost island of Japan. Eventually, the Japanese refused to surrender despite months of intense bombardments by the US. Then the Americans tested 2 nuclear weapons on the Japanese population, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. And then the Japanese empire surrendered. There was this ceremony on one of the warships. And ever since then, the Japanese have been under US occupation until today. Then, of course, there was the post-war period in which the Korean peninsula was divided between the Soviets and the Americans, which now North Korea and South Korea. South Korea is also under permanent US military occupation. Germany is now under permanent military occupation. So is Europe. So is Italy, and places like the Netherlands, etc. Even Turkey have US nuclear weapons on their soil as of today. So after the World War, what happened was that Germany was again divided up. East Germany, West Germany. The Iron Curtain came up very rapidly. And that's the beginning of the Cold War. So the old power structure disappeared. Europe became weakened. The UK became a second-rate power. France became a second-rate power. In the 1950s, there was a Suez crisis that confirmed this, that now the top dog is the US. It's no longer the UK or the French. The French tried to play the last geopolitical gamble. They failed. The Americans arm twisted them into going back. And then essentially from that time onwards, the US has been the undisputed ruler of the world. The UK, etc., are the vassal states of the US. And then the Cold War period begins. So that's where we can end this, I suppose.
Maybe one sentence I'll add as the end. The UN is a piece of shit.
The UN, okay, let's talk about the UN briefly. So at the end, when the Second World War was ending, the UN was created. And membership was open to everybody who declared war on Germany before March 1, 1945. So half the world's countries declared war on Germany, just in writing, not actual war, but they announced officially that we are declaring war on Germany. And those countries became the founding members of the United Nations. Of course, after the war was over, the structure was solidified. The victorious powers became the permanent members of the UN Security Council. India was offered a position, but India refused. Mr. Nehru did not want it. He said, give it to China. He was repeatedly requested to make India a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Mr. Nehru insisted repeatedly, again and again, China first. Then India, maybe, perhaps, maybe not.
Mr. Chavda, I hope you and me don't get assassinated for making content like this. My mom also kind of passed on that message to you through me. She's like, just ask sir to be a little careful. Both of you speak a lot of honest stuff, and human beings outside of politics or geopolitics are not supposed to speak of things like this. But we live in the age of podcasts and YouTube. We live in the age of correcting the history that we've been taught. And I feel we live in the age of calling a spade a spade. So maybe even if we get assassinated, well, at least this piece of content is on the internet forever. Do you want to end this particular episode in any other way?
I think these geopolitical cycles never end. The end of World War I was the prelude to World War II. The end of World War II was the prelude to the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was the prelude to the multipolarity that we are seeing now, and things are moving very rapidly. These geopolitical cycles occur again and again and again, just like the dynastic cycles in China. So if you learn geopolitics, you understand what's coming. And maybe something new is coming now, because we are seeing a lot of movement geopolitically today in the 21st century, in the 2020s. This is the decade of rapid geopolitical change. I hope a new conflict does not arise, but it could. So, yeah.
And for more on that conflict, go check out the last episode. Right now, sir and myself are going to head into the next one, which is called Dear America. It's for American audiences. So we've taken an active call to now create English podcasts purely for an international audience. Do you have any message for an international audience before we sign off? Anyone outside of the subcontinent?
I think the major narrative that is prevalent outside the subcontinent is a certain narrative created by the Western powers. The whole of social media is owned and operated by a certain country. We know what it is. It's the US. And a certain narrative is propagated through that. I think the international audience should look for other neutral narratives, non-Western narratives. Maybe there's something to learn from that. Narratives from someone like me or someone like us, because we see history and geopolitics through our Indian angle, which is a non-Western angle. So it's always beneficial to approach a certain subject from multiple angles and then use your own judgment and wisdom to see what the truth may be. Because the truth is somewhere in between. We may see things from a certain perspective. They may see things from a different perspective. Maybe we are both right in some ways, both wrong in some ways. So it always helps to get new perspectives.
Mr. Chavda, thank you for another brilliant episode. We'll be heading into the sequel called Dear America.
Thank you very much.
All right, so that was the episode for today. Make sure you check out the sequel episodes, which will be released in the following week. We've covered the events of the Cold War as well as modern day America in those videos. And if this is one of the first TRS episodes you're ever watching, I do recommend you check out the episode we did about the possibility of World War III, which is a modern day commentary on geopolitics. If you're an international audience member, if you're an international listener, I do urge you to share this podcast as much as you can. I do believe that India has a lot to offer to the world, be it from just a geopolitical perspective, be it in terms of subject experts, be it in terms of experiences. This is India's #1 podcast, and we're bringing you a lot more very soon. Follow us on Spotify. We're a Spotify exclusive. Every episode's available on Spotify 48 hours before it's available anywhere else in the world. The Ranveer Show will be back soon.